What's going on? Welcome in to another episode of the Fantasy Football Fellas podcast. My name is Tyler Plath. I'm hosting solo tonight. And the other two guys that are absent tonight, but always with me in spirit, are my co-hosts, Lucas Wenzel and Cameron Lawrence. The three amigos, the three stooges, just being dudes. We are the Fantasy Football Fellas. Welcome to our channel. If you're a first-time viewer or a returning viewer or listener, thanks for coming back. Much appreciated. Like I said, I'm flying solo tonight, and it's a Thursday episode, meaning it is our weekly preview episode. So I'll bring you everything you need to know about matchups in Week 16, which is pretty sad because it means it's almost the end of the regular season, but it also means fantasy playoffs. So now it matters more than ever to get your lineups right. And it all starts with getting insights and advice about your matchups. That's what I'm here to help you out with. So I'll also be talking about all the major news, notes, headlines, all that kind of stuff as of Wednesday, December 21st. Real quick, though, we've got a big 2023 ahead with lots of new and exciting content, and you should come along for the ride with us. We'd love to have you come with us and ride this thing out with us. So you can do that by following us on all of our social channels, or some of them, up to you. Here, you can find us over on Twitter at FFFellas. You can find us on Instagram at the FFFellas, TikTok, YouTube, anywhere else that you get your audio podcasts, Fantasy Football Fellas. If you're watching this on YouTube, first of all, hola. Second of all, you should subscribe if you haven't already, and turn the bell on to get notifications on when we post, to get all the most recent, up-to-date information that we are releasing via our social pages and all that kind of stuff. And lastly, come join our group chat over on Chalkboard. Not only will you get so much more than what's usually in our podcast episodes, but it's the perfect place for all those important fantasy playoff questions that you have. And it's completely free. It's completely free. You can find the link to our Chalkboard group that has over 1,600 members and counting in the link of, or in the description of this episode, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening, just audio only. With that, let's dive into some major and important news and notes at the midway point of the week. And as always, our news and notes are brought to you by our friends over at Sleeper, the number one fantasy platform in the world with over 4 million users. You've heard me and Lucas and Cameron all talk about how much we love Sleeper. We love them. It's a great place. It's a great app for the fantasy football manager. You can check them out with the link in the description of this episode as well. So, first piece of news really isn't news, and it's not really a headline, but this is important to know going into this week. There are 14 games total this week. That's normal. 11 of the 14 games are being played on Saturday. These updates have a different impact than normal because one less day for a majority of players than usual. It's one less day to recover from injuries. It's one less day to, you get the point. It's a little bit different than usual. So these headlines and news and notes need to be taken with a little more seriousness just because we are losing a day in the week. So first things up, let's start off with Jalen Hurts, number 3 overall player in fantasy football. He's still uncertain to play Saturday versus the Cowboys. Nick Sirianni came out and said, well, I'm not ruling him out. Like, his body heals a lot quicker than, the normal human body, than the normal human. Don't care. I don't care. You should anticipate him not playing. That's what you should do. You should anticipate him not playing. And if that's the case, Gardner Minshew would be the starter for the Eagles. We'll talk about Gardner Minshew a little bit later when we're previewing then the Eagle-Cowboys game. But it stinks knowing that it's playoff time and you could be without a guy like Jalen Hurts. That hurts. Wordplay is elite tonight. All right, on to the next one. Trace McSorley is now in line to start versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers after Colt McCoy was ruled out with a concussion. And if you didn't, figure out the implication, Trace McSorley is an Arizona Cardinal. This severely impacts guys like DeAndre Hopkins, Marquise Brown. And again, it's not ideal for fantasy playoffs. You don't want to have a backup quarterback. When you have a team's wide receiver one, you don't want the backup quarterback playing in fantasy playoffs. Imagine having the third string quarterback. Not great. Not great at all. Next piece of news we got is coming from Indianapolis because the Colts are benching Matt Ryan for a second time this year. And that's probably the last that we've seen Matt Ryan this year. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's the last that we see of Matt Ryan in general. I would not be surprised if Matt Ryan hangs up the cleats this offseason. Regardless, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. This is likely the last that we've seen of Matt Ryan this year. And in his place is not Sam Ehlinger. It's Nick Foles. Yeah, yikes. It wasn't pretty to begin with, and it's certainly not pretty now. This hurts guys like Paris Campbell, Paris Campbell and Alec Pierce were very sporadic and they were not very consistent. But this pretty much puts them on your bench rest of the year. And no Jonathan Taylor. That was made official today as well. Or I shouldn't say yes. When was that? It was Tuesday. That was made official Tuesday. So this Colts offense is just beat up. Really, the only player that you can play is Michael Pittman, and it's just an ugly volume play. And so you kind of have to knock him down to flex territory. But that's just a matter of the fact. Nick Chubb did not practice again on Wednesday, and with a Saturday game, it's time to start paying closer attention before it's too late. And if he can't go, it's then Kareem Hunt. But then again, there's Deshaun Watson and this kind of inconsistent, choppy Browns offense. So it's not really like great to begin with. I know Nick Chubb is Nick Chubb and he has his workload. But I don't know exactly if that same workload falls to Kareem Hunt if Nick Chubb can't go. We'll touch on the Browns later in their matchup preview. Ryan Tannehill is in serious doubt to play this week, meaning Malik Willis is in line to start against the Texans. Doesn't really matter for me. It's Derrick Henry versus a divisional opponent. We'll touch on that later. Ravens wide receiver Devin Duvernay is out for 2 months, clearing the path for Sammy Watkins, who was claimed by Baltimore on Tuesday to see some more work this week. The top 3 options for the Ravens pass catchers, besides Mark Andrews, Demarcus Robinson, Deshaun Jackson, Sammy Watkins. Not great. So you feel for a guy like Tyler Huntley. You feel for a guy like Lamar if he does come back this week, which, again, doesn't sound likely. But still, it is just not a great offensive situation for the Ravens. Unless your name is J.K. Dobbins. Because J.K. Dobbins, you, sir, have been on fire lately. Chris Olave is dealing with a hamstring injury, and he would have sat out practice on Tuesday if New Orleans practiced. So keep an eye on that situation. Khalil Herbert is coming off of the IR ahead of week 16, as is Dallas Goedert for the Eagles. Both players should be active for their games this coming week. We'll see what that, we'll preview what that workload, snap count, and all those things can be in their matchup preview. That's news and notes brought to you by our friends over at Sleeper. And again, you can check them out with the link in the description of this episode, whether you're watching on YouTube or the audio only on Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. On to the week 16 matchups here. All the stats that I have for teams when I'm talking about specific teams, most of these stats are certain amount of fantasy points allowed. These are all within the last 2 weeks. We're keeping the sample size small. Tries to capture the most recent trends in defenses, if you know what I'm trying to say. So let's start off with a Thursday night game between the Jacksonville Jaguars and the New York Jets. The Jets are favored by 1.5 in this game. I find that very interesting. But it is, I'm at the same time, I'm not surprised because Jacksonville has been very, very good lately. Jacksonville is allowing the 10th most fantasy points to running backs and the 3rd most to tight ends. Again, over the last 2 weeks, there's the theme. It'll be the same for everyone else. On the other side, the Jets are allowing the 10th most fantasy points to tight ends. Other than that, they're pretty stingy when it comes to fantasy points. I personally find this game super exciting. We touched on Trevor Lawrence and the Jaguars in our Boom Bust episode back on Tuesday. And the Jets are one of the more exciting teams. I know Zach Wilson's the quarterback, and I'm not super excited to watch Zach Wilson, but I'm excited to watch how everything else plays out. With this in mind, for the Jaguars, you're starting Trevor Lawrence. You're starting Evan Ingram. And I know that, that one came out very confident. Obviously, you're not going to play Evan Ingram over a guy like TJ Hawkinson, all that kind of stuff. But if you're needing a streaming option, if you struggle to find a tight end and Evan Ingram is there, I like Evan Ingram this week. Other Jaguars players, I would flex Travis Etienne, Christian Kirk, Zay Jones. Zay Jones has pretty much earned his way into lineups moving forward. But just going up against the Jets, I can't really see a way where they produce more than a flex spot. Maybe Christian Kirk, but play it safe and flex those guys. For the Jets, you're not starting Zach Wilson. I wouldn't start CJ Uzoma or Tyler Conklin, so that leaves you with Garrett Wilson. I would flex Garrett Wilson. Zonovan Knight should be good to go. He was questionable because he picked up an ankle injury, but he logged a full practice on Wednesday, so he should be good to go. And with how the backfield has looked lately for the Jets, looks like Zonovan Knight is going to get the bulk of carries. So I would start Zonovan Knight. And again, Jacksonville is allowing the 10th most fantasy points to running backs over the last 2 weeks. That's a very sneaky stat for Zonovan Knight. On to our Saturday games here. Starting off with the Seattle Seahawks traveling to Kansas City to take on the Chiefs, who are favored by 10 points in this game. This one could be a sneaky high-scoring game. Kansas City is allowing the 5th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, the 6th most fantasy points to tight ends. Seattle, on the other hand, is allowing the 3rd most fantasy points to running backs, the 7th most fantasy points to tight ends. Let's be honest for a second. Kansas City's counting their lucky stars that Seattle has kind of come back down to earth because Kansas City has not been playing well. Seattle has not been playing great either. Again, for Kansas City, obviously you're starting Mahomes, you're starting Travis Kelce. I would flex Pacheco, and I would even flex McKinnon this week Again, Seattle allowing that many points to running backs over the last 2 weeks bodes well for both Isaiah Pacheco and Jerick McKinnon. And I would even flex Juju as well, just as another pass catching option who's had double-digit targets, I believe, in back-to-back weeks. I know Seattle has been very tough against wide receivers. That's why I would flex Juju. For Seattle, you're starting Geno Smith. I would start Kenneth Walker. I would start DK Metcalf. Noah Fant if you're desperate. Kansas City does leak fantasy points. They've just allowed more points to quarterbacks and tight ends over the last 2 weeks. That's why I like DK. I like Kenneth Walker this week. But there's obviously a limit to those Seattle players just because Kansas City should comfortably win this game. But we said that against Houston, or we said that, against Houston, and then look what happened there. But you get what I'm trying to say. Kansas City's really good. And Seattle is meh. Next Saturday game we got is the New York Giants taking on the Minnesota Vikings, and the Vikings are favored by 4 points in this game. The Giants are allowing the 9th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, 9th most to running backs, 9th most to wide receivers. And Minnesota, on the other hand, is allowing the 5th most to wide receivers. This matchup works out really, really well for Minnesota, not just offensively, but defensively. If you're going to give the 9th most points to Kirk Cousins, the 9th most points to Dalvin Cook, the 9th most points to Justin Jefferson, Adam Thielen, and on the defensive side, they're allowing the 5th most fantasy points to wide receivers. And who are the wide receivers for the Giants? Yeah, like you see why it's a very nice matchup for Minnesota. Not to say that they can take this game easy, because New York could come in and actually steal one here. But the biggest question for this game is, can Minnesota regather themselves after last week's roller coaster game? I think they learned their lesson against Dallas, so I think they can come out with a victory here. I think they cover as well. They've not been great against the spread this year, but I think they can cover. For Giants players, Daniel Jones probably could be a top 15 option this week just based on his rushing upside. But I wouldn't force him into your lineups. And obviously you're starting Saquon Barkley. For Minnesota, on the other hand, Kirk Cousins you're starting, Dalvin Cook you're starting, Jefferson you're starting, Adam Thielen I would start. I would maybe put him in a flex. TJ Hawkinson, you have to start him, obviously. Again, like I said, I think Minnesota can come out with this one, but if Minnesota's not ready, the Giants can kind of take it to them. Next game we got on the list here, we got Buffalo taking on Chicago. Buffalo's favored by 9 points. And for good reason. Chicago is allowing the most fantasy points to quarterbacks and the 4th most to wide receivers. And Buffalo is allowing the 10th most fantasy points to wide receivers. This is a pretty straightforward game, except it's just the weather for this game, not ideal. We all thought it was super cold just watching the Buffalo-Miami game last week. It's going to be colder. It's going to be colder. Maybe no snow, but it's going to be colder than it was in Buffalo last week. Maybe you can get away with the running backs for Buffalo. I find it hard to choose between the two at this point. I could lean Singletary one day, and then I could wake up the next day and lean James Cook. So, it's one of those, if you feel like it, go ahead. But at the same time, it's fantasy playoffs. And if you don't feel like taking that risk, totally understandable. You're starting Josh Allen. You're starting Stephon Diggs. Dawson Knox. In his last 2 games, he's put up 14 and 21 fantasy points. I think if you need a tight end, you could start Dawson Knox this week. But I for sure am not expecting anything more than 18 fantasy points. And that sounds like, wow, Ty's really in on Dawson Knox. I'm not really. I kind of took the median. I don't know if 18 is not the median between 14 and 21. comments don't rip me for that. But I proceed with caution with Dawson Knox, but it's understandable why you would start him. For the Bears, Justin Fields, I would start. Montgomery, I think he could get away with a flex. It's just a volume play. I don't think Khalil Herbert is going to really take that much work away from Montgomery this week, just being Herbert's first game back. But that's it. Next up, we got the New Orleans Saints traveling to Cleveland to take on the Browns. Browns are favored by 2.5 in this game. And New Orleans is allowing the second most fantasy points to running backs. Cleveland's kind of turned around the defense a little bit, and they're not really leaking fantasy points anywhere. So what do we do here? Let's start with the Browns. I don't know if we can necessarily start Deshaun Watson. There was some intrigue to starting him the past couple of weeks, but I think it's shown and it's proven now that we can't really play Watson for the rest of the year. Running backs, we talked about Nick Chubb earlier with his foot injury. If he goes, you play him. If he doesn't, Kareem Hunt has to be in your lineup as well. And again, I'm not expecting the same amount of work to go to Kareem Hunt, but I'm still expecting the lead back to get enough work to be startable. Wide receivers, maybe Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper has been much better at home than he has been on the road. But Deshaun has really found a lot of trust with Donovan Peoples-Jones. I would maybe consider flexing Cooper and Donovan Peoples-Jones. That's just me. Njoku, you're going to start as well. I don't think Cleveland will put up that many points. So you're just kind of hoping for volume plays out of those guys. For the Saints, though, on the other hand, we touched on Olave's hamstring. Monitor that, because if he can't go, then they are really lacking weapons. And then it's going to be Jarvis Landry and Rashid Shaheed. I think that's how you say his name. It's really those two guys on the outside and Juwan Johnson at the tight end spot. But we need to talk about one player specifically. And that's Alvin Kamara. And what's happened to Alvin Kamara over the last 5 or 6 weeks. Since week 9, Alvin Kamara has been the running back 35 and averaging just 9 fantasy points per game in that stretch. From week 9 to week 13, he averaged 12 touches and 56 combined yards per game in 0 touchdowns. That's not good. He comes back in week 15 against Atlanta and he gets 21 carries for 91 yards, which is super encouraging. But he only got 2 targets. Maybe it was the matchup, but this isn't the Kamara of old, and it's a tough reality pill to swallow. The chances that we see Kamara put together those vintage games of 20 or more touches are pretty slim, especially with games against Cleveland coming up, Philadelphia, and Carolina, who aren't really leaking a whole lot of fantasy points to the running back position. If you made the playoffs with Kamara, hopefully you have enough depth, because Kamara could be a league loser this year. Yeah, I said it. A league loser. And it's a shame, because you took him, more than likely to be your running back 1. And he has just been a major, major letdown. Obviously, you have to play him. You know what he can do. It's going to take a whole lot more of wishful thinking and a whole lot more prayer than you would think to get Kamara back to his normal self. And that stinks. That really ended on a somber note. I didn't like that. Let's make this a little more encouraging here. Houston taking on Tennessee in Tennessee, and the Titans are favored by 3 here. Tennessee's been struggling lately. They're allowing the 10th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, the 12th most to wide receivers, second most to tight ends. Houston, on the other hand, the 7th most to quarterbacks, the most to running backs, the 4th most to tight ends. There's one player that is worth noting in this game, and of course it is the king, Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry, last 4 games against the Texans, he's rushed for over 200 yards in each game. Each game. So in his last 4 matchups with the Texans, he's pushing 900 rushing yards alone. That's insane. That is insane. There's nothing that really, there's really nothing else that matters in this game besides Derrick Henry. I'm going to say sorry in advance to those of you that are facing Derrick Henry this week because it's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be pretty. Obviously, yes, Derrick Henry is starting. I would also start Chikakonkwo. With Houston allowing the 4th most fantasy points to tight ends over the last 2 weeks, Malik Willis can find someone to trust in a little bit. Maybe it is Chikakonkwo. I wouldn't start Treylon Burks just yet. I wouldn't start Robert Woods. So if there is one other tight end, I would think it's Chikakonkwo. For Houston, though, nobody. You are not putting anyone in your starting lineups. On to the next game. Cincinnati traveling to Foxborough to take on the Patriots, and the Bengals are favored by just 3 points in this game, which is strange to me. I know it's Bill Belichick, but Cincinnati's red hot right now. They are red hot. Fantasy points are hard to come by against New England, but it doesn't matter when you have a high-powered offense. We saw that with Minnesota, and it really won't matter against Cincinnati this week. Only stat worth noting for Cincinnati is that they're allowing the 6th most fantasy points to wide receivers. But it doesn't really matter this week because there is not a whole lot that we can trust with this New England offense besides Ramondre Stevenson, who is the only Patriot that should be in a starting lineup this week. Otherwise, for Cincinnati players, Burrow starting, Joe Mixon starting, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins starting. That's really about it. That's a pretty straightforward one. That'll be an interesting game because that'll be a chess match, really, right? Bill Belichick going up against this high-powered offense. That'll be a fun watch. But I think you can kind of tell by the tone of my voice and how I describe this game. I think Cincinnati can come away with a victory in that one. Next game, Detroit taking on the Carolina Panthers, and the Panthers are 2.5-point dogs, which is understandable because Detroit is arguably one of the hotter, if not the hottest, not fantasy, NFL team. Carolina is allowing the 7th most fantasy points to wide receivers. Meanwhile, Detroit's allowing the 8th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, 3rd most fantasy points to wide receivers, and the 8th most to tight ends. To me, that means one thing. For Carolina, you're starting DJ Moore. That's it. I'm not starting Chuba Hubbard. I'm not starting Deontay Foreman. With how Detroit has been playing against the run lately, I didn't see the exact stat, and I wish I did because they've been lights out when it comes to stopping the run. For Detroit, though, you're going to start DeAndre Swift, just PPR upside. You're going to start Amon-Ra. I think Amon-Ra has a very good shot of posting some really, really good numbers this week. But the only issue is that he's got Jared Goff throwing him the ball. And yes, Jared Goff has been very good recently. But Jared Goff on the road is not the same as Jared Goff at home. When Goff is on the road, he averages only 10 fantasy points a game. That's not good. Now you mix in Carolina, who don't really give up a whole lot of points to the quarterback position. It seems like the matchup is great for Goff. I can't start Goff this week. Again, when you're only averaging 10 fantasy points in road games, I can't put you in my lineup. I'm sorry. That's especially when it comes to fantasy playoffs. I need points. 10 ain't cutting it. So Swift and Amon-Ra St. Brown are the two lines that you should start. I wouldn't even start Jamal Williams in this one. The yards per carry have been scary in the last 3 games. He's getting into borderline. He's getting into this territory of touchdown dependent. I think he's already there. Some people would argue, oh, not just yet. Personally, for me, I'm not playing Jamal Williams this week. That can come back to bite me, and if he proves me wrong, I will admit it. But what I've seen over the past 3 weeks is an inefficient rusher who is not really getting touchdowns anymore with little to no receiving work. That's usually not a formula for success. I do think Detroit takes care of business in Carolina, but Carolina also needs this game. Just a game behind Tampa in the division. So if Detroit's not careful, Carolina could come out and sneak that one away just because they want to win that game badly. Atlanta traveling to Baltimore to take on the Ravens. Baltimore's favored by 7 points in this game. Baltimore is tough to score fantasy points on. They have been all year, except for the wide receiver spot, but their season total, or their season total. Sorry, let me rephrase that. That was going to come out the worst way possible. Baltimore looks like they allow a lot of points per game to wide receivers. That was heavily inflated by the Miami game at the beginning of this year. Now that we have enough games added into that total, it's not as good of a matchup as it once was. Atlanta, though, on the other hand, is allowing the most fantasy points to tight end. So if there's a week that we see Mark Andrews come back a little bit, it should be this game. The one player I do want to touch on, though, is Drake London. And we may be seeing a little bit of a Drake London resurgence. He has 2 straight games with double-digit targets and 70-plus receiving yards. One of those games being with Marcus Mariota, but last week it was with Desmond Ridder. You have to play Drake London. And when I say have to, I'm not saying he's top 20, top 25 even. I still think he's a flex. But he's a volume play now. He's a volume play. And if there's one thing that fantasy football should teach you is that volume is king. Volume trumps everything. The kind of volume that Drake London is getting right now, and that he should be getting from Desmond Ridder, just being the most talented pass catcher for the Falcons, I think you can put him in your flex just as a straight up volume play. For Baltimore, on the other hand, we're not starting Tyler Huntley. Lamar Jackson, if he plays, you have to play him, but I wouldn't expect a whole lot. No wide receiver I'm starting. Obviously, you're starting Mark Andrews. Again, I touched on it a little bit, that Atlanta is allowing the most fantasy points to tight ends over the last 2 weeks. Yes, I know it's not been pretty with Mark Andrews, but this is the matchup that we've been waiting for. The other player for the Ravens, though, that needs to be in your lineup is J.K. Dobbins. He's got 2 straight games with 120 or more rushing yards. That boy's good. That boy is good. And if he can find the end zone and capitalize on the yardage, he could be a league winner. He could. He really could. Which is, there may be very few people that have this situation out there. But if you've got Alvin Kamara and you've got J.K. Dobbins on your team, you can sleep easy knowing that you can comfortably switch those 2 guys out. Next game we got is Washington taking on the San Francisco 49ers. San Francisco is favored by 7 in this game. San Francisco is allowing more fantasy points than expected to wide receivers and tight ends. They're kind of middle of the pack. You would think they're maybe, bottom 12 in points allowed. That's not the case, though. Meanwhile, Washington's allowing the 12th most fantasy points to the running back position. In this game, Washington needs a win badly. They need a win badly. They could not have afforded to lose against the Giants last week. And if it wasn't for horrible referee calls and decisions, they could have won. That's a conversation for another time. Like I said, they need a win badly, but it is just horrible schedule timing. It's tough to go into a game needing a win, but going up against the 49ers on the road. That's tough. For Washington, I think you can start Terry as a flex. I wouldn't start Jahan Dotson this week. Dotson's been hot the last 2 games. But this is just not I don't think this is a right matchup for him. For San Francisco, it's the usuals. I mean, I would flex Ayuk. Kittle, you have to play just based on his receiving upside. Christian McCaffrey is a top 3 play this week. San Francisco is going to take care of business. That was a pretty straightforward game. Next game we got is probably the game of the week. When I say game of the week, I mean more so like the game that everyone is going to want to watch. And it's the Eagles and the Cowboys. Dallas is allowing the 11th most fantasy points to the quarterback position and the 2nd most to the wide receiver position. That number is slightly inflated due to Zay Jones catching 3 touchdowns. But again, the defense allowed those touchdowns. So that's got to count against them for something. That has to count against them. Meanwhile, Philly is allowing the 4th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. Slightly inflated due to Justin Fields, because Justin Fields will just run all over you all day, and that's what he did to Philly. The big question, though, for this game, if Jalen Hurts doesn't go, what do we expect from Gardner Minshew? If you remember last year, Gardner Minshew had 2 starts. One in the middle of the season, one in week 18. In the first game, he put up 18 fantasy points. And in the second game, he put up 15 fantasy points. And believe it or not, that 15-point performance was against Dallas. What are the odds? What are the odds? When I say that I think the Eagles will be just fine with Gardner Minshew, I don't mean that in a expect A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith to put up the numbers that they were putting up with Jalen Hurts. That's not what I mean at all. I just think from a systematic standpoint, the Eagles will be okay. But obviously, not having Jalen Hurts takes a dimension of that offense out, because Gardner Minshew does not have the same rushing upside as Jalen Hurts, as to why Dallas is favored by 5 points in this game. I think Dallas does win, but Dallas needs to come out and play well. You cannot just expect Philly to roll over and just give them the game because they won't. So Dallas needs to come out and earn the win. I think they can. For Philly, I would start Miles Sanders. AJ Brown, I would start still. Devontae Smith, I see him as a more risky flex, again, just because of the quarterback situation. Dallas Goedert, I think you can, but same thing as Devontae Smith. It's a little more riskier than usual just because of the quarterback situation. For Dallas, on the other hand, you're starting everyone. And when I say everyone, I mean like the main names. We're not forcing Michael Gallup into lineups. We're not forcing Noah Brown or anything like that. Dak Prescott, Zeke, Tony Pollard, CeeDee Lamb, Dalton Schultz should all find their way into your lineups this week. There we go. All right, next game we got Raiders taking on the Steelers in the Saturday night game. Pittsburgh's favored by 2.5 in this game. And that says everything you really need to know. Vegas doesn't really believe in Vegas. Pittsburgh's defense has been locking down players in terms of fantasy points since TJ Watt came back. Vegas defense has also been playing a little bit better. But I just think Pittsburgh's offense is just good enough that it can kind of win the matchup against that Vegas defense. They just got to protect Trubisky, Pickett, whoever it is, whoever's under center for the Steelers. They got to keep them upright because Max Crosby can legitimately turn this game over just by himself. But I think the Steelers can do that. Raiders, you're starting the usuals. Josh Jacobs, Devontae Adams, Darren Waller. You kind of have to, but that's just because the tight end space is just scarce. So I would put Darren Waller in. For Pittsburgh, Najee Harris, you're starting. Deontay Johnson, who's been a volume play lately, you're playing him. Pat Freiermuth, again, same thing as Waller. Just the desert wasteland of tight ends. You got to play him. Let me add a little caveat to Deontay Johnson, though. If Trubisky is playing, then I'm playing Deontay Johnson. If Kenny Pickett is playing, I don't feel confident starting either Pickens or Deontay Johnson. So that'll be something to pay attention to. If you're a Deontay Johnson manager, you're praying for Trubisky because after a 10-catch performance that we saw last week from Deontay, that's what you're used to seeing from a guy like Deontay Johnson. On to our Christmas Day games here. First, starting it off with our noon game between the Green Bay Packers and the Miami Dolphins. Miami's favored by 4 in this game. And Miami is allowing the 3rd most fantasy points to quarterbacks, the 8th most to running backs, the 11th most to wide receivers, the 5th most to tight ends. This defense has not been playing super great, but they can get stops when they need them, and they can get pressure on quarterbacks. Green Bay is playing a little bit better on defense lately, but that's because they played Chicago and the Rams the last 2 weeks. Miami is going to put Green Bay right back in their place. I think it is a legitimate question to ask. Could Green Bay steal this one? I don't think so. Excuse me, but I think that's, again, it's a legitimate question to ask. If Miami comes out sluggish and slow, Green Bay could come out with a victory in that one. It wouldn't surprise me. For Green Bay, if you're needing a quarterback, I think Rodgers is a fine start. Again, with Miami allowing the 3rd most fantasy points to quarterbacks, I think that bodes well for Rodgers, especially after he got Romeo Doubs back on Monday Night Football. So now he's got Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, and Alan Lazard at his disposal. That'll help him out a lot. Aaron Jones, I would start. Christian Watson, I would start. I can't start Romeo Doubs or Alan Lazard moving forward. I just need to see another game against a much better defense in Miami to see how this offense functions. I'm taking that Rams game with a grain of salt. For Miami, Tua, start. Tyreek, obvious. Waddle, obvious. If you're in a deeper league, I would consider flexing Mostert, albeit it's very risky. But like I said, in deeper leagues, if you're struggling between Mostert and let's say a George Pickens, I would lean Raheem Mostert. Both are risky plays, but I think Mostert gets the more or has the better chance of getting volume. I think Miami wins that game. But like I said, again, Green Bay could steal it if Miami's not prepared and if they come out slow. Next game on Christmas Day, we got the Denver Broncos taking on the LA Rams. Disgusting. This is a disgusting game. Rams are allowing the 4th most fantasy points to running backs. Denver's allowing the 9th most fantasy points to tight ends. I don't want to spend too much time on this game. One question, can Baker lead the Rams after last week's debacle against the Packers? I don't think so. Rams, I'm not starting anyone. Cam Akers, I know Cam Akers is getting the volume. But going up against this Denver defense is going to be tough. Denver, on the other hand, I would start Latavius Murray, but only if Aaron Donald is out, which it sounds like he will be, but if not, I wouldn't play Latavius. Jerry Jeudy, I would start. Just with the potential that Courtland Sutton could be on a snap count. It sounds like he'll be back. But it just sounds like Sutton could be on a snap count a little bit. So Jeudy would be number one option for Russ. So I think you could flex Jerry Jeudy. Christmas night game between Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Arizona Cardinals. Tampa is favored by 7.5. And again, let me remind you, Arizona has to play Trace McSorley as their quarterback. Arizona is allowing the 6th most fantasy points to running backs. Meanwhile, Tampa is allowing the 6th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, 11th most to running backs, and 8th most to wide receivers. Tampa Bay is getting incredibly lucky with this game because I think Arizona would have an outside chance of upsetting Tampa if Colt McCoy was playing. That's a hot take, but I stand by it. Again, this is a much needed game for Tampa, who need a win to stay ahead in the division. They're getting lucky with this one. For Tampa, I would start both Rachaad White and Leonard Fournette. Again, Arizona allowing the 6th most fantasy points to running backs. Yes. Fournette has been the pass catching option. Rachaad White is still getting double-digit carries. They're making it work with both those guys, and I think they can both benefit from this matchup. Chris Godwin, obvious. You're playing him. Mike Evans. You're playing him, but hopefully you've got points in other players to make up for Mike Evans. Because again, you're banking on red zone opportunities with Mike Evans, which have not been really happening for the Buccaneers this year. I don't know if you can necessarily bench Mike Evans. If you can, go ahead, but you need a competent replacement for him. For Arizona, James Conner, I would start. DeAndre Hopkins, pretty much down at a flex spot. Marquise Brown, also in a flex spot. Like, it's not looking great for Arizona when Trace McSorley is their starting quarterback going up against Tampa. So Monday night game now. To wrap up week 16, we've got the Chargers taking on the Colts. Indy is allowing the second most fantasy points to quarterbacks, fifth most to running backs, and the most to wide receivers. And I wonder why that is. Oh, right, because they gave up the largest comeback in NFL history. Right. Yeah, that makes sense. The Chargers are another team, though, that has tightened things up on the defensive end, making it that much tougher for a Colts offense being led by Nick Foles with no Jonathan Taylor and a suspect offensive line. Yikes. Chargers, you're starting the usuals. Herbert, Eckler, Keenan Allen, Mike Williams. Yes, start those guys. Only player you're really starting for Indianapolis is Michael Pittman, and he's a flex. Very similar to Drake London. I think it's really just a volume play. And there's really no guarantee of volume for Pittman. So you play him on the hope of volume, which doesn't sound great. If you got options like elsewhere, but same thing with Mike Evans. If you have a competent replacement, then it makes sense. But you don't just sit Pittman because you can. You don't do that. So that wraps up the week 16 preview here. Let me give you my winners for each game here. I'll take the Jaguars over the Jets. I would love that because that helps us out because we've been all in on Trevor Lawrence since the beginning of this year. And if you didn't catch all the praise that we had for Trevor Lawrence, check that out in our Tuesday episode. For our Saturday games, give me Kansas City over Seattle, Minnesota over the Giants, Buffalo over Chicago. Give me the Browns over the Saints. Give me the Titans over the Texans, Bengals over the Patriots. Give me the Lions over the Panthers, Ravens over the Falcons, Niners over the Commanders, Cowboys over the Eagles. Give me the Steelers over the Raiders, Miami over Green Bay. Give me the Broncos over the Rams. Give me Tampa over Arizona, and give me the Chargers over the Colts. And as I said, that finishes up our Week 16 preview, along with all those news and notes that we mentioned earlier. That wraps up the episode. So thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Fantasy Football Fellas podcast. Again, you can find us on all social platforms. You find us on Twitter at FFFellas, Instagram at the FFFellas. You find us on TikTok, YouTube, anywhere else you get your podcasts, Fantasy Football Fellas. And if you're wanting to join our group chat over on Chalkboard, that's completely free. The link for that is in the description of the episode, whether you're watching or listening. So best of luck to all of you, whether you're in week 1 or week 2 of your fantasy playoffs. Tune into our Stardom episode coming out on Saturday, where we talk player props, our starts of the weeks, and all that good stuff. On behalf of my absent co-host and Lucas Wenzel, who is at Lucas Wenzel on Twitter, Cameron Lawrence at CamLaw317 on Twitter. My name is Tyler Plath at Tyler_Plath on Twitter. Thanks for tuning in again. We hope to see you on Saturday in our future episodes for the rest of the year and going into 2023, because again, we've got big plans with bigger and much more exciting content for you. Thanks again for tuning in, and we will see you on the next episode. Deuces.